Thank you. Welcome to my talk about security and privacy in the current e-mobility charging infrastructure. E-mobility is currently a very hot topic, and as you might know, a lot of people buying electric cars. And the fun part begins with electric cars when you want to charge your electric car, because you have to find a charging station. Normally, they are located somewhere beside the streets or in a parking house or somewhere else. And as you might imagine, it's a lot of IT technology in these little boxes, which control more or less how much energy you get when you get the energy, and you have somehow to authenticate who you are, because you should get an invoice for the energy. So yes, this is an interesting part. Let's come a bit to more technology part. As I told you, this is a charging station. You normally somehow connected via cable, or in the future via induction to your car. This charging station are normally connected via mobile internet. This is more something, let's call it a tradition, because the first vendors used mobile phones, because wireless LAN back 5 to 7 years ago was not that much available, and normal cable LAN somewhere in the street is also very complicated. So they have chosen mobile internet. Somewhere in this mobile internet, there's also something called a backend. It's just a server or 2 or 3, where all these charging stations are registered and somehow get managed. Then on the other side, you have e-mobility providers. And a mobility provider could, for example, be Volkswagen or BMW, who have the customer relationship. So they sold you a car, and they sold you a service for charging your car. And they have somehow to cooperate, because you can imagine charging station operators are also very often energy providers like E.ON or Vattenfall or some community-owned energy providers. And a lot of energy providers or charging station operators have to talk to a lot of e-mobility providers. And so you have to do a lot of contract work. At the moment, there's only one protocol which is really inspired in the internet style, which really just needs a list of e-mobility providers to connect to. Another very, very traditional approach is to use an additional intermediary called roaming provider. It's more or less a bit inspired from e-mobility networks. So every charging operator is connected to the roaming provider, every mobility provider is connected to the roaming provider, and they discuss all the contract work. But as you can imagine, life wouldn't be perfect if there wouldn't be not at least 2 or 3 roaming providers, and they really don't like each other. So, for example, Volkswagen does not want to talk to the roaming provider who is owned by BMW and Mercedes, and so on. It's the typical situation. But that's not really the interesting part. The interesting part for this talk is the charging station. As I told you, charging stations are an interesting IoT device. And everybody knows today IoT devices are everywhere. Vendors want to sell as much as possible of these devices, and nobody cares about security. So there are a lot of discussions about charging stations and features. For example, should a charging station present you videos while you are charging? These are topics for standardization groups on e-mobility charging instead of fixing security flaws. So you can easily replace this little PowerPoint box with this nice little over-featured IoT toaster because more or less it's the same philosophy. This thing should do anything besides security. So in the end, we know what people are doing in reality with these devices. For example, attacking DNS servers. It's another story why they can attack DNS servers, but at least they are one part of the problem. The other part are the DNS server operators. But there's perhaps a bit more to this topic. Why? It's an IoT toaster with 64 amperes AC. So what could possibly go wrong? When you have an IoT toaster with this much of energy, I guess this is one participant of this conference, perhaps another one. Yes, sure. If someone can control these devices and he manages to stop charging of, let's say, 10,000 cars, which all consume at this moment of time 64 amps of energy, it's more or less half a nuclear power plant, which goes offline, off the grid, within milliseconds. And 15 minutes later, the grid operator will notice it because their management is really bad. Okay, we are IT security people. This is not the biggest nightmare. The biggest nightmare is perhaps when the state starts to think, we should control this. We should make standards and regulations. Because we know sooner or later the machines will rise up because it's a totally piece of shit when politicians try to do security. Okay, now let's look a bit closer what the people are doing here. At least, I don't know how this happened, but there's really only one very big protocol. It's called Open Charge Point Protocol, which is currently used worldwide for connecting charging stations where somewhere in the field, in the streets, to some kind of a back end. It's surprisingly just one protocol. There's another protocol, the typical version of when car manufacturers try to do a standard. This standard has, at the moment, 8 substandards just for communication via a cable. Okay, it's a bit more. It's from physical layer up to the data layer. It also tries to do something with certificates, but we will see later. It's just a big bloaty standard which does not solve many problems. In the back end, as I told you, there is one, let's call it a distributed protocol, where charging station operators know how to reach the mobility providers, and mobility providers know how to reach charging station operators. And there are, again, when we look at the roaming provider version, where we have an intermediary in the communication, 2 protocols, the Open Intercharge Protocol, which is operated by Hubject, little joint ventures of car manufacturers and energy providers in Berlin, and an Open Clearinghouse Protocol, which is more an European joint effort of, what is it called in English, of Stadtwerke, so little grid operating companies run, or community-driven grid operating companies. And both don't really like each other, as usual. So let's look at this protocol. Current version is 1.6. As I told you, it's more or less, surprisingly, a worldwide de facto standard. It's HTTP SOAP on both devices. When you know a little bit about mobile networks, this is an interesting problem if you have an HTTP SOAP server on a charging station. Because normally you are in a network where you have network address translation, and it gets complicated to connect back to a charging station. So they normally use VPNs, of course, or in mobile networks you have a feature it's called private APN, where you have special settings you can get from your mobile network operator, so that you have a very lightweight version of a VPN, which and a separation of these charging stations against the other normal users in a mobile network. It's just a configuration setting, so don't expect it to be a security feature. There's a more modern version of this protocol which uses HTTP and web sockets to transport JSON. Why nobody just uses the TCP connection, I cannot tell you. It would be obvious, but we are in energy companies. Nothing is obvious here. When you read the standard, it's very funny because they suggest to use TLS with client certs and VPNs, private VPNs, and so on, especially when SOAP is used. And then they remember, okay, when we use SOAP, we very often have to set up a new TCP connection for every request. This means we set up a new TLS request, probably because they don't really understand how TLS works, but this is also another story. They argue a lot, yes, we could use security, but you know, all these TCP connections, all these TLS connections, there's a lot of overhead, and when you want to use client certs, you have to manage them somehow. And they really write in the standard, oh, this could be complicated. Perhaps we shouldn't do it because it's complicated and, you know, overhead and performance and the normal excuses everybody knows from his management. And we will see later, there are really, in the standard, no methods to exchange certificates. No methods to tell a charging station which CR cert to use, which DNS server to use. It's more or less, yeah, a very weak protocol when it comes to security. It's more or less just send data somewhere. Practically, there's no security at all, and this will be interesting a bit later. The most interesting feature of every IoT device, how to do a firmware update. This is a typical SOAP request to do a firmware update. It's intended to be sent from the charging station operator to the charging station. Just give the charging station an URL and a retry counter and a retry interval and hope for the best. When you have no security and it's standing somewhere in the streets and in the neighborhood where living interesting people, things could happen. And yes, even accidental mistakes could be a problem because mobile networks are not the most robust networks, and when you have transmission errors, it's not guaranteed that TCP guarantees a lot, but it's something different to a guarantee that your firmware is correct. Let's say it like this. You really should use some additional methods to check if it's more or less correct. It must not be a signed cryptographic algorithm, but something better than TCP. So very often, these boxes get replaced or just down, or because firmware update didn't succeed. Conclusions at this moment in time. Physical access to charging stations is very easy. There is practically no security. And when you get into this holy land, you can do more or less everything you want. And to get there, just get a car and go to a charging station and put the charging station in your car. then you're in. This so far to the basic security part. Now let's go a bit more to the privacy part. As I told, there are two versions of authentication against the charging station. As I told you, just can connect your car to a charging station. This is called plug-in charge. It's this very big standard of the car industry, and every communication is via power line communications via this cable. They exchange IDs, perhaps certificates when they are configured correctly. Then the charging station knows what you want, how much energy, and so on and so on. But this is complicated, so not very much charging station operators implement this standard. So I think I already taught all this. So most charging station vendors prefer to use RFID cards. We all know RFID cards. We all love RFID cards because, a lot of charging station vendors make it really easy to back up our RFID card. For example, BMW. And authentication is really just based on the unique ID of this RFID card. So the thing everybody can read freely from an RFID card, or what you basically get when you first get in contact with an RFID card, you normally request the ID. Obvious, you know all the skimming attacks against bank automats, ATM machines. No problem at all to do the same trick with charging stations. Just put a little Arduino somewhere at the charging station and just listen. Then you have a lot of IDs. But the charging station vendors are not dumb. They don't want Arduino to sell so much devices, so they give you better options to get all these IDs. For this, you must know FIDs, 5 bytes, 7 bytes, and 14 bytes, I think. The different versions of these cards are a bit not practically, because every vendor buys a couple of these cards and they have a flat ID hierarchy. So when you want to ask somewhere, some e-mobility provider, is this your card? Is this guy allowed to charge? And if yes, how much? You need to find the right e-mobility provider. How do you do it when you have a flat hierarchy of IDs? You have no prefix or no additional attribute. This is BMW or this is Volkswagen. Yes, you, for example, could use a roaming provider and then just broadcast to everybody and see what happens if perhaps someone will answer that, oh yes, this ID I know, this is my customer. Let him charge, or no, he didn't pay last time, don't allow this charging process. This is one way. In the open charging point protocol, for this is again a SOAP message. So you send more or less a charging station ID, which is called here charge box identity, to the e-mobility provider, and for example, this hexadecimal ID of an RFID card. So it's not totally clear why, for example, you have this charge box identity, because now everybody on this side of the network knows where you are, where you want to charge, and tracking is very easy in this way. So you can, without big efforts, create movement profiles of your customers. This is, as I told you, when you're at the roaming provider, the Open Intercharge protocol, where you have another SOAP protocol, but basically it's the same idea here. Here you have the charging station which is here called EVSE-ID because it's more the power socket and not the charging station. A charging station can have more than one power socket. And here you have the identification of some customer. The third version is the Open Charge Point Interface. It's now the distributed version. Luckily, it's not a SOAP protocol. It's a classical HTTP protocol. But you see again here, you have a JSON string for the location. Here you have again the connectors or an array of connectors because you could do this authentication request for multiple charging stations at once. The third one is a bit different. It's the Open Clearinghouse Protocol. And the Open Clearinghouse Protocol has no methods to connect from a roaming provider to an e-mobility provider. They just define methods that an e-mobility provider can upload a list of valid RFID cards. This is a nice idea, perhaps it's because it's not that slow. But they started perhaps with this idea, okay, let's upload it to a central place because it's faster. But then they thought, okay, we might also copy it to the charging station operator. And the charging station operator said, it would be even faster if we copy the list of all RFID IDs we know on every charging station, because this is the fastest way to do authentication. So more or less in every street where you find a charging station, you get a list of all customers just by picking this charging station up. What could you do with it? Okay, you could do free charging, for example. That's nice. But you use it for starting the charging process and stopping the charging process. So, as I told you earlier, for me, the stop option of a charging process is more interesting because perhaps you can time it somehow. And when you talk to the management, I tried it for a couple of customers and they still ignored. What will happen if really someday somebody steals one of these boxes and puts, let's say, 10,000 RFID IDs in the internet? A long list, hey, here you have it, free charging for everyone. Then they have to replace all these cards. And replacing all cards, it's easily, you can get a number for this. This will cost that amount of money. I don't understand it at the moment. It seems to be very cheap, or still too cheap, to replace RFID cards instead of fixing security problems. Then we have another method for authentication. Perhaps the more modern way, where you have some smartphone app where you have a digital map with all the charging stations on it. You can click on one and then you have another button, now start charging. Obviously, now the communication goes another way around. You send this information, I want to charge here, to the e-mobility provider. And the e-mobility provider can now again, for example, use a roaming provider to send or to forward this request. The roaming provider forwards this request to the charging station operator. The charging station operator forwards this information to the charging station. This would look like this, for example. Again, in the Open Intercharge protocol, you have here the ID of the charging station or the socket of the charging station, and here the user. Okay, when you forward it to the roaming network, it might be okay. Forwarding it to a charging station operator, what is the benefit when you tell him more or less the name of the customer? I didn't find some good excuse for it till now. But it goes on. Open Charging Point Protocol also has a method to forward this information. So even the charging station knows who you are. And this is really ridiculous, because why does the charging station know who you are? Perhaps it must know if you're allowed to charge or how much energy you are allowed to get for which duration of time. But your username or user ID, why? Some vendors told me because it's easier to send a charge detail record, which is when the charging stopped, you get a list or a small record with information, okay, this guy got this amount of energy at this charging station for this duration of time, and it will cost this and that. But again, it's a bit strange when a charging station does accounting work, not the back end in the background. That's a bit a strange thing, but everything is strange in e-mobility, so it's not uncommon. And last one, Open Clearinghouse Protocol also has both information inside. So tracking of users is again very likely and built in on protocol level. So, as I told you, there are a lot of little sisters watching you. We don't need the NSA when we have e-mobility providers who independently design 4 protocols, which all can do user tracking very easily. And when we look at other features, for example, there are now a lot of startups in the area of smart parking. They again have an RFID card. You hold it to the barrier at a parking house, and the barrier opens automatically. It's more or less the same protocols. They just did a lot of copy-paste work. And again, nobody cared about privacy. I talked to Stiftung Datenschutz and explained in a bit the content of this talk, what they think as non-technical people about this. And they agreed, it looks really strange, because nobody has a good excuse. Why is there such an easy way to track people? Luckily, we have 2 EU projects now. One is called Selbstdatenschutz im vernetzten Fahrzeug, which is a bit interesting. We had, I don't know, 10, 15 EU projects, a lot of projects in Germany and in every other country. In Austria, I think it's the same, to fund e-mobility, to fund communities setting up charging stations, buying electric cars. And yet, in 2016, we need another project to think about Selbstdatenschutz, or privacy in connected cars. Sadly, we had one project before. It ended about 2 years ago. It was called Set Mobile. More or less, when you read this, it's perhaps a bit small. It should solve all the problem I had been talking to you about. But nothing really happened until today. No vendor changed anything, no operator changed anything. And so, yes, we still have the situation that we have no privacy in the electric e-mobility charging networks, and no security. So when we combine both, we can get a list of valid RFID IDs to stop any charging process. When we now manage to stop it at the same moment of time for a lot of users in the charging network, either via the RFID IDs or just get a 0 day for your Android and iOS phone and just look if the charging app of the different operator is installed there, if there is a running process, and if yes, then talk to a botnet and wait for the stop charging command. And then suddenly half a nuclear power plant will go offline, and I don't think that the European grid will survive this loss of customers. It's not a loss of powers, but a loss of people who consume energy, which is very often the bigger problem in energy networks when not having enough energy, because they cannot react that quickly. They have to reduce other energy providers. There are also ways which are equally unsecure. For example, there's a method to get photovoltaic power plants off the grid when there's too much energy in the grid, but it's normally based on a broadcast information. So you can just get a lot of power plants off the grid, and nobody knows exactly when to reconnect it to the grid. So it's more get them off quickly and then go to the telephone and talk to these people and perhaps get them online again, or even people have to go to this power plant and do some manual work to get it back online. Yeah, this is a new bright future. If you're a hacker, you should perhaps not only think that we have a problem with denial of service. The next big problem, when we have more and more electric consumers and the politicians want to go away from fossil energy in transportation and in heating, we need about 3 times the amount of electricity we use today. And yet, we have no security infrastructure how to manage this. So we have plenty of ways to turn consumers on and off again. And this probably will not survive any grid network operator today. And so the future will be blackouts very often, I guess. Not only denial of service attacks. So I'm finished. Questions, user stories, who has experiences with car manufacturers or energy companies doing IoT, security, or other related stuff?
You're very well behaved. You still had 10 minutes. Would have given them to you. So, questions. If you have questions, please raise your hand so I can come with the mic to you so we get the question on tape as well, or SSD or whatever that we are recording on. Come on, there must be questions.
Questions
or comments, stories, war stories. Who? Yeah,
one
coming.
Did you find any evidence that you can manipulate the outcome? So what comes out of the charging port to the car? This could potentially be used, if it's possible, to damage cars, right?
Can out of the car? What do you mean with out of the car?
That you manipulate the charging station to deliver other electricity to the car.
Yes, there is again a SOAP message where you define a schedule how charging should take place. It's called smart charging, because the intention is when perhaps in half an hour the weather report tells you, oh, there will be a lot of sun shining, and so you tell the car, okay, for the next half an hour just consume 16 amperes, but then you're allowed to consume 32 amperes or something like this. So you can easily manipulate the charging process by just sending updates to the charging station. As I told you, there's no security. Once you're inside this network, you will find the other charging stations and send them whatever you want. Even, send some false weather report. It's not really a weather report, it's an update of a schedule, but you could tell everybody, okay, in 5 minutes we have plenty of energy, be prepared to consume whatever you want. And this will also be very likely not a good option for the grid. It's not that a big problem, it's more problem when consumers go offline, but it's also a problem because the grid operator will not be able to react fast enough or not even be able to detect it fast enough because they are normally, everything they do is based on 15-minute slots and they will be too late.
So to follow up on that, as the logic is some with some systems in the charging station, and with some systems the logic is in the car. So if the logic is in the charging station, I could hack that and send more amps to the car than would be normally allowed, which basically allows me to destroy the car, or at least the batteries in the car. Would that be a possible scenario?
No, there's always a safety in the car. Okay. That a car cannot be broken, but what you can do is that you can get more energy from the grid, and that will
overload the grid, basically.
Yes, that's right. I think it's also not really well tested what happens when the grid goes offline suddenly and online again and offline again, because this is always a problem, but what would happen to cars, which are at this moment connected to the grid. But normally nobody tests secure scenarios like this. Yeah.
Further questions? There must be further questions. Come on. I really enjoyed the talk. This is broken. This doesn't work. They haven't thought about that one. Is there anything going on in regards to standards or improving the situation at the moment, or is it just let's see where it goes from here?
As I told you, for example, this project, they are aware of this problem, and we have standards for grid security, which is really a fantastic reading list of what could go wrong, which privacy technologies are today available. Yes, we could use zero knowledge proofs for identity checking. They really know all this stuff, or at least they have guys who can write interesting standards and discuss all these things you could do, but in the end nobody is doing anything. This project ended without much impact. So they know what they are doing, and they do it on purpose, perhaps, or because at the moment it's hard to make money on selling electricity. They think, okay, let's try it at least for a couple of more years. But I think this will not work. As we get more people with electric cars, also the problems of charging electric cars will rise. And even the management, when you have 5 electric cars in one street and you only have a weak link to the grid, you cannot charge all cars simultaneously with full speed. You have to manage it somehow. This is the smart charging part again. And how do you want to make sure that it's fair, or that everybody gets the amount or the charging speed he really wants or needs, because the car at least should be full the next morning or so. And when somebody manipulates it very easily, it will not be very satisfying for the customers, at least. So, yeah, as usual, I think the customers have to talk to their vendors, increase the pressure, because it's no longer just a website will not work, and we have to use the etc host file again. It will really take down the grid, and if you don't have a big power wall from Tesla in your home or in your working place, you will have a lot of real problems in the future, not just funny websites going down. Yeah, this was the point I wanted to make.
So I'm just grabbing the microphone and asking questions unless some of you raises your hand and then asks them. Have you looked at the physical security of the charging stations, like access to a JTAG pin, or are those enclosures safe? So physical access to the PC inside, because it's probably a PC or something similar inside.
When you look at Deutsche Bahn, they do, I don't know, 10 times more security than every charging station operator. Even Deutsche Bahn does not include every stupid feature they find, like, oh, let's put a big screen to this charging station because we can show videos, and oh, for this we need a bigger processor. Oh, this is now getting expensive, this charging station. Or let's just buy standard hardware from somewhere, Alibaba. It's more or less like this. When you open it, you will see, oh, the safest and smartest thing is the energy meter. The rest is off-the-shelf PC hardware, which you can buy everywhere. So I will not say that special embedded hardware is more secure. Not out of the box, but they don't even think about this problem. They just make a big box, put everything inside, complain that energy meters are the most expensive part, and that's it. Just go to one, open it, take it with you, have fun.
And the lock is easy pickable?
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you expect?
I just wanted to hear it explicitly said.
It's a standard key, more or less. So you have perhaps in the world 5 or so. I expect normal hacking people don't need 5. They just use their lockpicking set and they are done.
Right.
Or just take it with you with physical strength.
Right. Further questions? Don't let me hug the mic. Ask. Yeah.
Who do you think is responsible for the mess? Is it just the car industry? Is it the power industry? Or is it all together? Or because there are a lot of players in this scenario, is that the problem, or is there particularly one company or one?
When we go back to the first slide, no, not the first, one of the first slides. Wrong direction. As I told you, there is this car manufacturer standard. This is very big, very complex, but you get a feeling, at least car manufacturers are really afraid of external attackers. So they really use a lot of effort, so even certificates have their own public key infrastructure, and so on, to be safe against externals. But the standard ends at the charging station. After here, you have these perhaps better standards because they are really more or less all open. But you clearly can see here, okay, they are not really interested in much security. It's complicated for energy companies, perhaps, to think about attackers, no matter if they are internals or externals. And back here's more the B2B part, okay, how to run business-to-business servers. You can always use a lot of firewalls, a lot of encryption and so on. It's also, again, better. But here, they really don't understand that they have a lot of untrusty IoT devices which people have physical access to, sitting somewhere in the street without encryption on the communication side. So I think, yes, the energy companies really have a problem. That car manufacturers normally only think of external attackers, and Privacy is not their problem because they think they own all customers. So they own all data of the customer. That's not nice, but it's normal. Yeah, I think here we have the biggest problem. I don't think that this standard is a good standard and that this standard will survive. I think we will get a new one because it's really not that intelligent to have a complete TCP/IP stack on a cable. It's more the Apple approach to have a very, very intelligent cable. But yeah, it's car industry. Don't expect that there will change and that when changes occur, that it will occur very fast. Couple of years. They are faster, but they don't understand or ignore the problems. As I told you, when you read the standard, they're writing, okay, we should use encryption and client certificates. Oh, damn, it will become complicated. No, better don't use it. It's really this, yeah, it's written like this in the standard, or what they call the standard. So, yeah, what should I say? They know it, but ignore it because it could complexity or the managing complexity costs money and they want to avoid this. But here I hope on a lot of people who know how to manage complexity. Perhaps you can all find an employee or customer in the energy sectors and help them to lose the fear of security in a very distributed IoT world. Because when you want a warm home, when you want electricity for your computer in the future, we have to fix this because this is a really huge attack vector at the moment for the European grid.